A very good evening to all our viewers, and welcome to Friday's edition of the Evening Review. My name is Toiwanjabela, your host, and we are tonight welcoming on the show a guest who has been here before, as a matter of fact. That is Bertha Tobias, and she is known mostly for her firm activism. Very strong activism in especially matters that are related to women rights, equality, and all of that. And she's engaging us tonight on some of those and other things related to youth empowerment. Bertha, welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, as a matter of fact.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Last time you were here was 2020, and it was at the height of a very exciting campaign at the time, for which you were an active participant. That was the Shut It All Down movement that really took a strong stand against a number of issues at the time. I'm just wondering, when you reflect back nearly 2 years later, what has been the impact of that very strong position that you and others took at the time?
Right. Thank you for the question. So you're right that when the last time I was here, it was at the height, right?
Yeah.
It was when everything was delicate and nobody quite knew what was the correct thing to say.
Yeah.
So I really think when I think about the impact of Shut It All Down, I think about it in two ways.
Yeah.
So I think about its impact on us as a country, and then I think about it as it relates specifically to young people. So as a country, I think what it has done is definitely communicate and reinforce the understanding that young people have the capacity to speak truth to power.
Yeah.
And they have the ability to not only analyze the sort of political and socio-political landscape of the country, but also to say, this is what's not holding up and this is how we would like it to look like. And this is how we're going to contribute to that effort. So I think that's what it has done, is reinforce our capacity to do that. And in that way, I think strengthened mechanisms of accountability. Maybe not institutionalized formal mechanisms, but at least as it relates to social discourse, there's been a demonstration by young people that we're not afraid of having opinions and speaking truth to power, which I think is crucially important for any young democracy like Namibia.
No, definitely. Look, I also thought at the time it was something rare in our Republican life that you would see people standing up in the manner that you guys did and saying the things to authorities that you said, and in the manner that you said it. I thought that was also, I mean, those with ears will have listened at the time, and I think the president's set going forward from there was very important. But some of the issues that you raised, they still persist. There were issues of how the rape culture in the country, the general abuse of women, the killings. From that point of view, those things still persist. What do you think is the reason for that? Is it that you guys were not clear in your message, or that you did your part up to a particular point, and then someone maybe in a position of authority was supposed to take it further then, and maybe that didn't happen?
Yeah. So I'll be completely honest over and say that I have also had to deal with sort of a personal reckoning in that very question is, but what was all this work for, and putting your head on a chopping block and taking a microphone, and when all of these things still persist, it's very difficult not to get discouraged. But if I could go back in time, I'd do it again, I'd still be as engaged. And I think for the very reasons that I outlined in sort of the first part of your question, which is the speaking truth to power and reinforcing the capacity of young people to have a stand and to take a strong stand and to be taken seriously. So I think more as it relates to sort of practical outcomes, what I think was crucially important was a sort of an official set of directives issued by the Office of the Prime Minister right after the protests, which is a document that we don't actually talk about, which is essentially responsive solutions to the protests, right? So these are things like sort of mandating 24/7 patrols, etc. So obviously, the ideal situation is for the solutions outlined by the Office of the Prime Minister at the time to be carried out. But I, and I'm sure, a bunch of other young activists as well, have had to come to terms with the fact that at some point, it's kind of what you said, right? We highlight this thing, we inject the sense of urgency, and that is as much as we can do, because unfortunately there's people who have the institutional mechanisms to implement, and if they don't implement, I think it becomes incredibly dangerous as well, because then you have people being discouraged and moving out of the country and never coming back.
Yeah, exactly. You are based outside the country, but at least you came back. And I know that I follow your work from a distance, and I think you inspire a lot of young people, young women in particular. But if even a man like myself is inspired, I'm sure the impact with younger women is even much bigger. But again, Bertha is about momentum. It's about keeping the steam, coming off your efforts. And of course, there's been COVID disruptions and all these kind of things. A lot of us thought in 2020 that we're going to see a continuation of some of that, what you guys did that year, especially against the background that a lot of those issues persisted. But somehow the steam has been lost. From my perspective, what do you think is the cause of that?
So again, I'll be honest again, and I think the steam, a lot of it has to do with the fact that when Shut It All Down, sort of the genesis of Shut It All Down was spontaneous, right? So it was two people sitting in a cafe and saying, let's protest, and 24 hours later, 800 people shutting down the central business district. Yeah. I think with any kind of effort that is not sort of well planned out, when there's a lack of direction, the momentum and the steam does die out. So I honestly think it's that. It boils down to a lack of organizational structure. And I think the reason I am slowly being generous about the steam being let off is understanding that even the young people who were involved in Shut It All Down were young people who were spontaneously pulled into the movement. And I think we underestimate the just personal psychosocial impact of being thrust to the forefront of a movement or a national cause without having that been a prior part of your plans. So a lot of young people are people with full-time students and people with full-time jobs who've already had prior commitments. So I'm always very delicate in acknowledging the question of what is the steam about Shut It All Down. And I think it's because my disdain for sort of the obligation that we try to place on these young people is the fact that there's people who do have the capacity to help, but they don't help because they insist that these young people, need to continue. And not because they really care about the cause, but because they want to say, well, you started it, let's see how far you can take it. So I think it really boils down to that. It's a simple issue of a lack of organization and a lack of individual responsibility to say, but am I going to dedicate my life to this spontaneous thing, or am I going to contribute in other ways? And that's obviously very contentious, because you can also make the argument that, no, but you started it, so you have to see it through. And it's like, but to what extent, really?
I understand. But I think then, speaking to what you just said now, the spontaneous nature of it, a leaderless sort of movement without formal structures is like thinking individuals who congregated to confront a social evil, and then with that formed a group of people, got formed. So I suppose that must have also had an impact, that there isn't really a formally structured anything. It's really just people who say, look, this is our country and this is the least we can do. No, indeed. Now, tell me, Bertha, also then one of the things that I thought could be capitalized on by the movement, as much as it's not an organized sort of body, is that there are from time to time, you know, there are these big incidences reported in the press. I remember towards the end of last year, there was this big issue of a social worker in Kavango West region who impregnated a girl that was referred to him because she was raped by someone else. Impregnated the girl was then referred to this man, and the man impregnated the girl himself, a social worker. And that for me is not the big news. The big news is the fact that he was readmitted back at work. And he's the only social worker in the region, meaning every other victim has to go through him. It's not like there are other alternatives there. And I thought these are the kind of incidences that the movement must awake from its slumber, if I can call it that way, to say, look, guys, let's go and march at Doreen Sioka's office. Let's go and express our discontent with these kind of behaviors. How can a government that is supposed to protect all of us admit this man back at work amid all this? Because this is not it's a very complicated thing. A child referred to you because she was raped by someone, then you rape her yourself. So I thought, again, you are based in the USA now, but those on the ground I thought could capitalize on stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would have been a moment, and I think you brilliantly put it, to awaken the movement from its slumber. But I think that takes me all the way back again to sort of I think it was your second question, about we can do so much. And when you put your head on the chopping block as a group of young people, and you've gone all the way up to meeting the president and speaking to the president, and issues persist, the truth is that as a human being, you give up at some point, or you're discouraged. And I think definitely it's not a conversation we've had as a movement, but I definitely think there's a certain degree of, I don't want to call it defeat, although I don't think there's anything wrong with admitting defeat, but I know for me at least, it's definitely a sense of discouragement, because you think, okay, I mean, Shannon Wasserfall, may her soul rest in peace, was a huge issue, right? There's in fact a headline today in the paper, and that was the genesis of Shut It All Down, and still nothing has happened. So I think as it relates to just general psychosocial sustainability of how you can keep people engaged in something, again we ask, how much should we speak, how many times should we protest, until people who have the power to make change.
Because that reminds me of my own work, as a journalist. You know, the amount of things that we expose on a daily basis, and our job really is to put the information out there, hoping that the relevant officers and stakeholders will then take it further, and you know, things just persist. So I understand also to a greater degree why yourself and your colleagues are also in that situation. Before we go on a break, Bertha, the one last question that I want to ask you on this specific issue of Shut It All Down is, last year there were headlines in the papers about, I don't know if I can call them members of the because it's not a membership organization, but let me use the term, one of the activists involved in the Shut It All Down movement, who apparently embezzled funds. It was a big issue. Other people from elsewhere also came out and said, oh, he also scammed me and stuff like that. How was that matter handled? What is the status now?
Right. So I think, first of all, I want to say I'm so proud of how Shut It All Down handled that. So what we did was essentially compile a document that we published, which is what we made available to journalists as well as to our funders, who obviously owed an explanation, with a timeline of follow-ups and all the sort of limitations that we reached as it relates to that correspondence. Where we're at now is that those funds have been given back to Shut It All Down. They've been returned. And I think what we sort of organically did was ask ourselves the question, what is important right now? Is it bringing this individual to justice, whatever our version of justice is, or is it continuing with the work? And I think we went with the latter. So what we did was essentially disperse a lot of those funds to organizations that were already doing the work that we're doing. So we're looking at, for instance, things like the Feminist Festival, organizations like VCRC, who already had the mandate, and they were carrying out the work. So I think it was asking ourselves, what is the essence of the work, and how can we use the momentum and the credibility of other existing bodies to just support those efforts. So that's where we're at now, is those funds have been used to support other sort of projects by other groups, and all of that will be published in our sort of report.
Okay, no, it's good. I'm asking because credibility is important, especially when you're fighting for a very important cause like the one you do, and there's a lot of people internationally and locally, of course, who are watching your work and want to help in some way, and they will always think that if there's that level of transparency, then of course they can commit their resources to that. We go for a quick break and then return for the last part of the show. We continue our conversation with Bertha Tobias, who is a very active and progressive, if I may add, activist of our country. Let's talk about progressive things now.
Right.
Not that the previous topic was not progressive, it was, most definitely, but let's talk about the issues, youth unemployment, for example, youth empowerment. These two words are forever on the lips of particularly our national leaders. And, we are being called, or you guys are being called upon to become more innovative and to empower yourself to take advantage of the available remedies for self-emancipation and stuff like that. What do you think is the current status of those aspects, youth innovation in particular?
Right. So that's I think a brilliant sort of conversation that we need to start having. I think just before we got here, talking about how I think this is an exciting time for our country. So I've been thinking a lot, for instance, just about the green hydrogen project that's currently being championed particularly through the office of the Presidential Economic Advisor. And thinking about how I think we're essentially saying the same thing and doing the same things about innovation. However, we're doing it in fragmented and disjointed ways, which makes it seem like we're having a different conversations. So I'm thinking about three things. It's that green hydrogen project. It's the president's statement last year in December when he said the government is not God and that young people should create their own jobs, and the backlash to that statement. And I'm thinking about just social media youth-driven initiatives by young people, right? So people selling cake jars or blue junkies or makeup pages on Instagram or rising influencers. I think all of those things is us saying that we need to innovate and we have the capacity, but I think what's missing is a link and sort of supporting mechanisms to make sure that young people understand not only that they have the capacity to innovate, but also that they have the support. So I think when you look around, you do see that there's different efforts to support youth innovation. We have, I think, NAST launched a youth cafe through funding by the Embassy of Finland, and they supported, I believe, some unemployed youth from Havana. There's 570 young people graduated from there. So those are brilliant, but we're not having conversations about those. And in the absence of those conversations, it looks like there's nobody cares about innovation. And it's something that I've started to feel very strongly about, specifically because of where I go to school, and where I see young people simply doing cool things because there's support, and the time frame between ideation and execution is significantly less because there's supporting mechanisms in place. And then obviously look at the landscape here at home, and it's not there. So it's something that I've recently taken on my heart.
Do you think then that some of those challenges that you spoke about, I mean, look, I have a sense that the heart is there for young people to do that. The willingness, at least at the theoretical level, is there. Practically, there are challenges, there are recurring thematic issues that people always talk about and say, look, capital is an issue. Skills, are we skilled enough? But of course, I mean, it's not about just the technical things. You spoke about just jazz. I don't think it requires a lot of a lot of that, but it's about the spirit to say, I'm gonna put this thing together and I'm gonna sell it. What do you think are the inhibiting factors to some of these ambitions?
You know, with that question, I think about an iconic Burna Boy moment. I don't know if you listen to Burna Boy.
Always.
Yeah, where he was being interviewed by BBC about his Grammy.
Yeah.
And, he was asked how he feels about his Grammy. Yeah. And he said the only regret he has is the fact that he didn't get it a long time ago. Because he feels like he deserved it a long time ago.
African giant.
Yes, the African giant, exactly.
Because that is actually where he came from, because he says, I also watched an interview, sorry to interrupt you there, but there was this interview again on, I think it was on Sway in the morning, and he was asked about why he titled, I think, one of his albums African Giant, and he said he was going to perform in the USA or somewhere, and on the list of performers, he was in a very small font. Then he told them, guys, I'm an African giant, you can't put me, like that. But please continue.
Yes.
Yeah. So of course he felt then that he should have won that before.
Yes, exactly.
Much earlier. Yeah.
Yes. So on a more serious note, he attributed that to the lack of government support, right? So studios not being accessible to creatives, for instance, or just like you mentioned, capital. So I think there's definitely an inhibiting set of conditions to create and to innovate. And even when there is, I don't think there's enough sort of access to information. But I think the biggest thing I've been thinking about as well is just how we talk about innovation, right? So I think when I compare where I go to school, sort of, and how innovation seems to come so easily to my schoolmates in the US, I ask myself, why does it seem like there's such a clinical distance between me and this concept of innovation and entrepreneurship? And I think it's even just the language around it and the ease with which people talk about it. At school, people say, hey guys, like, we should start an app, and the next week they've launched an app. Because there's mechanisms, but also because there's so much ease to it. Whereas here, I think we talk about it at summits and conferences, and it doesn't seem particularly accessible to, for instance, a young person who doesn't have that capital, who doesn't have proximity to power or big names. And I think in the absence of that, just genuine ease with which we talk about innovation and entrepreneurship, and in the absence of constantly talking about it, that we don't do it, or we rather outsource it to other people, and they come here and they sell us our own stuff.
Indeed. When you woke up to the headlines, I know the time difference between Namibia and the USA, when you woke up to headlines saying that the president had told young people that government is not God and that they must create their own jobs, and it's not the first time, it's a regular narrative in government where you hear leaders say that. The vice president of SWAPO, Netumana Lindaitwa, also said it at some stage. Look, I'm not opposed to the idea in general to encourage people to say, look, I think, Bertha, you're a brilliant woman, and you have proven yourself already in some spaces that you could actually carry yourself forward, go from here. But to sort of make it a general requirement, What did you make of that when you just woke up to that headline?
So my immediate sense to that headline is a brilliant sort of tweet. But I think it was by Melvin Angula, who said that you cannot innovate on a hungry stomach.
Yeah.
And that, I think we underestimate the immense difficulty of innovating and creating when you are hungry.
Yeah.
Then obviously think about, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how a lot of young people, a lot of my peers are thinking about physiological basic needs.
Yes.
Like, how do I get a place to rent
Yes.
so that I can attend school? And if I'm a woman, how do I get there safely? So those are things that we're thinking about. So kind of like what you said, there's nothing wrong with it in principle. But I think that call for young people to innovate is unfair and almost cruel in the absence of supporting mechanisms by government.
Yeah.
I think where I will credit sort of the call to innovate is the fact that the Office of the President is leading by example with a $9.4 billion project, right, for green hydrogen and for Namibia to become a green hydrogen powerhouse. And that's great. I do think, however, if we want that spirit of innovation to continue within Namibia as a whole, there's no way we can keep talking about that without creating those supporting mechanisms. In fact, it's a conversation I was having with my sister the other day as well, where there are certain people and certain young people who do have the luxury to think about ideating and executing because everything else has been taken care of and because they have the support. But the reality is that most people don't have that, and they will probably not be able to access that in the near future. And the two things that cannot be true at the same time is people innovating and people being hungry.
Yeah.
Something will have to give.
Yeah. Look, I at some stage, I think it was when I bought my first house some years ago, and I was doing a lot of work on my house, and I hired a lot of artisans at the time, around 2014. And I was impressed at the time. 2014 was before our current challenges kicked in, because we have a lot of them now. Where, one guy comes to weld your door, this one comes to put some pipe, someone, I think in that context it was correct to say you come out of VTC and then stand on your own. It's a bit practical. But if I studied education or law, I have to work for Sisa Namanje for 2 years maybe before I can then start off coming up with my own law firm or whatever. That is just the reality, really. So my fear is that, if you say, look, go to university, graduate, look for a job where you can. If you get a job, create some sort of foundation for you to stand on and be on your own going forward. That I can understand. But the call seems to be, from time to time, when you listen to these leaders, it is as if they are saying, straight out of university, without capital, without any asset to attach your applications to for bank financing, that you must just start doing that. And that is, for me, my where I think that there's an element of arrogance and sheer insensitivity about some of that rhetoric. Yeah. But yes, so please.
Let me just add on to that as well. I do think that, I think so Malcolm Gladwell has this brilliant book called David and Goliath, which is about perspective and how when you're sort of on the outside or on, occupying different spaces, you can see perspective. So something that I always think about, there was a brilliant TikTok that the current youth presidential advisor, Desiree Matias, made. I don't know if you've seen it, but it was a TikTok that sort of, compiled achievements of the advisor's office and, how there were 400 artisans for who jobs were created, etc. So I thought to myself, but this is brilliant work and this is progress. So there's something missing, I think, as it relates to either information dissemination about opportunities that are accessible, or that information is only accessible to other people. So I do think there's also, yes, an insensitivity, I agree, because of the disregard for the fact that lots of people don't have or are not in a socioeconomic space where they can think about innovation. But I also think just general information about who knows where to go to innovate is not super accessible. Whether that is information campaigns as a solution is another conversation, but I think there's work to some degree. It's just people don't know about the work, and that definitely contributes to the animosity between different stakeholders.
No, thank you for that addendum. The final question then, in the interest of time, Bertha, is around what is, as a follower of happenings, what do you think has been the most impactful attempt to stimulate innovation among young people in our country?
Wow.
Did I put you on the spot?
Yeah, let's see. So I think I wouldn't say there's a biggest one. And I think my struggle to answer that question is because all the sort of attempts to stimulate innovation and critical thought, I don't think we can see the impacts right now.
Yeah.
The most recent one I'm thinking, and that wasn't really a stimulation and innovation, but rather a dialogue, was when young people went to, I think it was 200 young people went to engage the president.
Yes.
So that wasn't, it wasn't innovation necessarily, but it was conversation.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about sort of the NUST's Youth Cafe. That for me is something that I feel very strongly about, and it's something that I wish we were talking about more, and how we can replicate that model.
Yeah.
Although it was sort of only 570 young people, that is 570 young people being taught how to think critically, how to identify needs in their communities, how to draw up business plans. So I'm also thinking about the work that is constantly being done by One Economy Foundation, the African Pathfinder Leaders Initiative under under the current CEO of One Economy Foundation, is also brilliant work. So I think there's lots of disjointed efforts to sort of stimulate youth innovation. I don't think there's a single one. I do think the biggest stakeholders in youth innovation are young people. I think young people are doing brilliant work that we're not talking about enough. Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about Chomi Bites, and how Chomi Bites has been, I don't know if you know Chomi Bites.
No, I don't know.
It's essentially the Uber Eats of Namibia, and they're doing brilliant work, and they've been so consistent in their work. After Break Magazine, you probably, yes. So all of that, I think, is young people with heart and with spirit that are doing great things that I wish we were saying more about.
Exactly. I'm now tempted to briefly ask one last question. It just came on my mind now, and that is to say that when we have brilliant young minds like yours, how do we safeguard and jealously protect these? Because we have seen a trend in our country where brilliant people become co-opted into the system, either a government system or some other bureaucracy, and they become completely neutralized to the extent that you may no longer, the Bertha of 2020 disappears completely when there are issues, serious issues facing women or the girl child or society in general. She can no longer say that which she said in 2020, because now it has become very uncomfortable. That truth has become very uncomfortable to where she finds herself in that particular point in time. So, and this has been going on for years now. We know people who say, "Oh, that guy was brilliant in the 90s. Oh, he used to be a very firebrand activist, or whatever." Then suddenly you look at them, but those of us now who were not old enough in the 90s to notice those things, you say, "But this guy was brilliant in the 90s. It doesn't look like he was brilliant in the 90s." So what is it that we must also do? Because I mean, for me, development of a country is puzzles that have to come together, and that is one puzzle also that we have to protect our, I suppose, our brain as a country, and so forth. When you come back from the USA, and you come back, and you're looking for a job, and there are some people who say, "Bertha, we have something for you, but you have to slow down on some things." What are we going to do as a country?
Right. So I think my straightforward intuitive response to that is a tweet. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, as you can tell. But is something that Gwen Lister had tweeted, I think, at the beginning of this year about rewarding excellence and shying away from rewarding mediocrity as a country. So I think the moment we can move to a point where we reward genuine excellence and work and output and impact, then it becomes very difficult for brilliant young people to compromise themselves. Because if excellence, there's a directly proportional relationship between your brilliance and your work and the reward that you get, whether it be that be in the form of social capital, job opportunities, then I think we can be on an upward trajectory as a movement, as a country, movements, as a country. But I do think for as long as we reward singing like canaries and, reward people who pander to power and cannot think for themselves and speak for themselves, we will constantly have people being co-opted into systems that don't work for people. But I think if we can if we can start and insist on rewarding excellence and work, I think we can get there easily.
Indeed. Bertha, thank you very much for making time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wish you the very best for your studies this year, and all the best for the year ahead.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, sure. That is Bertha Tobias, or Tobias, speaking to us about just sharing, of course, with us some of her ideas around some of the issues affecting our young people in the country. Thank you for watching, and have a brilliant weekend ahead.